Welcome back to the briefing. There are two numbers that explain why Iran's nuclear-armed military apparatus is experiencing a hierarchical and financial paralysis unprecedented in the history of modern warfare, and the gap between them is not a policy failure or a strategic miscalculation. It is the mathematical proof that the regime has collapsed from within. Number one, zero. That is the amount of money that ordinary Iranian citizens can access from Bank Sepah and Bank Melli, the country's largest financial institutions, which froze all accounts without explanation and confirmed the regime's bankruptcy. Number two, 8. That is the number of eggs that the average monthly salary of an Iranian citizen can purchase right now. Let that sink in. The government that controls nuclear facilities, operates ballistic missile programs, funds proxy networks across the Middle East, and fields one of the largest standing armies in the region, cannot keep its banking system operational and cannot maintain a currency that allows its own population to buy food with their wages. Stay with me, because this is not about sanctions or external pressure. This is about a financial seizure operation disguised as technical maintenance. The central bank announced that account freezes were due to technical updates to communication networks. That is cover language for direct confiscation of civilian deposits, because the regime cannot pay salaries to Revolutionary Guard forces and Basij militia members. The government is not experiencing a liquidity crisis that can be solved with monetary policy. The government has run out of money and is now stealing from its own population its bank accounts to keep military units operational. And the reason the regime is in this position reveals a vulnerability that no amount of military hardware can compensate for. The United Arab Emirates, after absorbing Iranian bombardment of its civilian infrastructure, made a decision that cut the regime's cash flow more effectively than any military strike. The UAE froze all accounts and assets belonging to Iranian elites hidden in Emirati financial institutions. These were not sanctioned funds that international law required freezing. These were private wealth stashed in Dubai and Abu Dhabi by regime officials, Revolutionary Guard commanders, and connected businessmen who used the UAE as their offshore banking center. And when those accounts froze, the regime lost access to the liquid capital it uses to circumvent sanctions, pay operatives, and maintain cash reserves that keep critical systems running. Here is the scale of what was hidden offshore. Ali Ansari, the businessman who serves as a front for Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, purchased hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property across Europe using money laundered through shell companies and intermediary transactions. The London portfolio alone is valued at $150 million. This is not wealth accumulated from legitimate business activity. This is systematic theft from state institutions, oil revenue, and confiscated assets that was moved offshore to protect it from domestic instability and international sanctions. And the moment the UAE decided to freeze those accounts, the regime lost the financial cushion that allowed it to operate despite sanctions. Now, the only source of immediate cash is civilian bank deposits, which is why Bank Melli and Bank Sepah locked every account and left millions of Iranians unable to access their own money. And while the regime is seizing civilian savings to pay military salaries, the supreme leader, who is supposed to be commanding this war, is in a hospital bed on a respirator. Mojtaba Khamenei is in Sina Hospital with severe wounds to his abdomen and legs sustained in the bombardment that killed his father, under the care of Dr. Zafar Gandhi and Dr. Morashi, fighting for his life on mechanical life support systems that are keeping his organs functional. He is completely unaware that the country has entered a war. He's completely unaware that his family was eliminated in the bombardment that wounded him. The doctors are keeping him sedated and uninformed because his medical condition cannot withstand the psychological shock of learning that his wife, mother, and son were killed in the strike that he has been appointed supreme leader in his father's place to lead a country at war, and that Israel has publicly declared him target number one with a stated policy of systematic elimination. This is not a leader governing under difficult circumstances. This is a man in a vegetative state whose name is being used to legitimize decisions he is not making and cannot make. The actual command of Iran's military and government has passed to Ali Larijani, the former Speaker of Parliament, who is now operating as the shadow commander behind the scenes. The Assembly of Experts, the body responsible for selecting the supreme leader, appointed Mojtaba even though he never requested the position, even though he has no political base, and even though rivals, including grandchildren of Khamenei, were available. The decision to elevate someone who is medically incapacitated and politically inexperienced while the country is under sustained bombardment is not a succession process. It is an internal coup disguised as constitutional continuity. The rivals who were passed over put forward a man who cannot govern, cannot appear in public, and will serve as a dead target or a sacrificial figure while they maintain actual control through Larijani and other deep state actors. And here is what that means for governmental continuity. President Masoud Pezeshkian, the elected head of the civilian government, admitted publicly that neither he nor anyone in his administration has been able to communicate with the new supreme leader since the appointment on Sunday. The civilian wing of government and the deep state security apparatus are no longer communicating. Pezeshkian's visit to the hospital was not a policy meeting. It was a symbolic confirmation operation to verify that the supreme leader is physically alive, not to receive strategic direction or coordinate governmental action. The state has split into parallel structures, where one side operates under constitutional authority that no longer connects to the other side that controls actual military and security decisions. Now, consider what happens when this financial collapse combines with the human cost that has already been paid. In January, the regime slaughtered between 30,000 and 40,000 people during protests triggered by economic desperation and systemic corruption. Not wounded, not arrested, killed. The scale of violence deployed against unarmed civilians in a single month exceeds the casualty figures from most conventional military engagements. And that violence was necessary from the regime's perspective because allowing the protests to continue would have threatened the system's survival. But now the economic conditions that triggered those January protests have gotten exponentially worse. Bank accounts are frozen. Salaries buy 8 eggs per month. The currency has collapsed to the point where an entire month of work cannot purchase basic nutrition. And the regime's response is not to address the economic crisis, but to deploy more violence while stealing what little savings remain accessible. The Iran Mall tells the story of how the corruption eating the system from inside created this collapse. In 2013, Ayandeh Bank was established with state backing and depositor funds that ordinary Iranians believed were being invested in legitimate commercial activities. Those funds were diverted to construct what was designed to be the world's largest shopping mall, a structure twice the size of the Pentagon built in the architectural style of 16th century Persian palaces, with elaborate courtyards, decorative tilework, and grand entrances designed to project power and wealth. The complex was supposed to house luxury retail, entertainment venues, hotels, and commercial spaces that would generate revenue and validate the investment. But the project was not a commercial investment based on market analysis of consumer demand or economic forecasting. It was a vanity project designed to demonstrate regime prestige and provide construction contracts to firms connected to Revolutionary Guard commanders and political elites who extracted profits at every stage of development. The mall failed economically because it was never designed to succeed economically. It was designed to transfer wealth from depositors to insiders through construction spending. Ayandeh Bank collapsed under the weight of non-performing loans that could never be repaid because the borrowers were the same people who controlled the bank. And the government, facing a potential depositor panic that could trigger runs on other institutions, forcibly merged the failed Ayandeh Bank with Bank Melli to prevent immediate collapse. But the merger did not solve the underlying insolvency. It just transferred the losses to a larger institution and delayed the reckoning. And when Bank Melli froze accounts, it was not because of sanctions or external pressure. It was because the Ayandeh Bank merger had poisoned the entire system with losses that could not be absorbed without confiscating depositor funds. And here is the detail that reveals how deep the corruption goes. Ali Ansari, the businessman who fronts for the supreme leader's wealth, should have been prosecuted for money laundering, sanctions evasion, and financial crimes that contributed directly to the banking crisis. But prosecuting him would expose the supreme leader's offshore assets and the systematic theft that funds the lifestyle of regime elites. So instead of prosecuting Ansari, the regime sacrificed the banking system to protect him. That decision, more than any military defeat or external sanction, demonstrates that the system prioritizes protecting connected insiders over maintaining basic economic function. And that priority is why the regime is now collapsing financially while trying to fight a war. Israel recognized the leadership vacuum and exploited it with surgical precision by publicly announcing that whoever becomes supreme leader automatically becomes target number one. Israel made it physically dangerous and politically impossible for Mojtaba to appear in public or deliver the kind of speech that would demonstrate continuity of command. A leader who cannot appear on camera, cannot address the nation, cannot visit military units, and cannot perform the basic ceremonial functions of the office is not a leader. He is a name attached to decisions being made by other people. And those other people, primarily Ali Larijani, are now making strategic choices without the constitutional authority or political legitimacy that would normally come from holding the supreme leader position. The economic metrics are so severe that they predict internal explosion rather than external defeat. When an entire month's salary buys 8 eggs, the population is not poor. The population is being starved. When banks freeze all accounts without explanation, trust in the financial system does not degrade. It evaporates completely. Trust is the foundation of modern economies. People deposit money in banks because they trust they can withdraw it. Businesses accept currency because they trust it will hold value. Employees work for salaries because they trust those salaries will purchase necessities. When that trust is destroyed by watching banks confiscate savings and watching currency become worthless, the economic system does not reform. It collapses and gets replaced through violence. The January protests that killed 30 to 40,000 people occurred before the banking freeze, before the salary collapse to 8 eggs, before the UAE froze offshore accounts. The next wave of protest will occur under conditions far worse than those that triggered January's massacre. And the security forces who would be deployed to suppress those protests are the same forces whose salaries the regime cannot pay without stealing civilian deposits. Here is the strategic trap. Revolutionary Guard commanders and Basij militia leaders whose salaries are not being paid have two options. They can continue following orders from a command structure that cannot compensate them, or they can act independently as rogue units pursuing their own interests. Rogue military units with access to ballistic missiles, nuclear facilities, and stockpiled weapons do not follow strategic plans or diplomatic constraints. They act based on immediate survival calculations and local command decisions that may not align with any centralized authority. And when the person who is supposed to exercise centralized authority is on a respirator, unaware that a war is happening, the probability of rogue actions increases exponentially. The proxy networks that Iran funds across the Middle East are facing the same financial strangulation. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias receive funding through channels that depend on Iranian oil revenue, sanctions evasion networks, and offshore accounts. When the UAE froze those accounts, and when Iran's banking system collapsed, the flow of money to proxy forces stopped. These organizations do not have independent revenue streams sufficient to maintain operations. They depend on Iranian funding for weapons, salaries, and logistics. Cut the funding and the proxy network does not scale back operations gradually. It fractures into competing factions, fighting over diminishing resources, while trying to maintain territorial control and political influence with no financial backing. What happens when a nuclear-armed country's banking system freezes all civilian accounts? Its currency collapses to 8 eggs per month purchasing power. Its supreme leader is on a respirator, unaware of the war. Its actual commander has no constitutional authority. Its military forces are not being paid. Its offshore assets are frozen, and its population has already endured a massacre of 30 to 40,000 people in January under economic conditions better than what exists now. What happens when the system that funded proxy networks across the Middle East for decades suddenly loses access to the financial mechanisms that sustain those operations? What happens when military units whose salaries are unpaid control nuclear facilities and ballistic missiles? The answer is not external defeat. The answer is internal explosion that creates a regional black hole where centralized authority ceases to exist and armed groups operate independently based on survival calculations. And the world is watching that collapse happen in real time while the regime steals money from frozen bank accounts to pay militias for one more week.